Good afternoon. I am Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special World Water Day event. Water in Armed Conflict, organized in partnership with the Geneva Water Hub, our good neighbors at UNICEF, next door, and the permanent mission of the Netherlands to the United Nations. Many thanks to each of you. This is the second event in 2 years that we have organized in partnership with the Geneva Water Hub. Some of you may remember the event last year when IPI helped to launch the final report of the high-level panel on water and peace, which was chaired by His Excellency, Mr. Danilo Turk. Welcome back. Welcome back, Francois. In that session, we discussed the critical linkages among water, peace, and security. In particular, the notion that while we often talk about the risk of conflicts over water, we must not forget that water is an inherently shared resource, and water cooperation and water diplomacy can be made powerful instruments for peace. This was one of the principal findings of the 2017 final report of the high-level panel, A Matter of Survival. In this way, we can see water as less a cause of war and more a potential catalyst for building and sustaining peace. Yet, even when not a cause of war, water has been increasingly used as a weapon or a target of war. We see this particularly in urban settings, when wars are fought in cities, as they often are in our increasingly urbanized world. Vital water infrastructure becomes particularly vulnerable and in need of protection. This is, of course, the objective, or one of the objectives, of the Geneva List of Principles on the protection of water infrastructure, which we will be discussing on our panel, along with the UNICEF Advocacy Alert, Water Under Fire, on the particular dangers that children face due to unsafe water and sanitation during conflict. But before we turn to our esteemed panel to discuss all this, it is my pleasure to introduce our opening speaker, the Honorable Kevin Rudd. Most of you know him as the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, the inaugural president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, but in this room, I'm pleased to say we think of him as the chair of IPI's Board of Directors since last year. But perhaps most relevant for today's event and the commemoration of the 2019 World Water Day is that Kevin is also chair of Water and Sanitation for All, a global multi-stakeholder partnership working to catalyze political leadership and coordinate and monitor progress towards achieving the sanitation, water, and hygiene-related targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. All good and necessary work. Mr. Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. Friends, we gather here today as an international community. And given the part of the world that I come from, it would be appropriate for me to acknowledge publicly with great sadness recent events in Christchurch in New Zealand and the mindless slaughter of so many of our Muslim brothers and sisters by, I regret to say, an Australian terrorist. So here we gather as members of the international family, and here we gather as believers in the United Nations system, and believers in the fact that we are better than all of that. And so I begin with that moment's reflection as we go to the subject at hand today. Well, welcome to IPI, International Peace Institute. The United Nations, as you know, next year will have been around for 75 years. That's a fair old stretch. It's almost as old here as Warren. So, sorry about that, mate. The IPI has been here for nearly 50 years. Am I right, Adam? Next year. So UN 75, IPI 50. We're planning our own birthday party next year. So those of you who have creative, constructive ideas, let us know how you think we should celebrate this institution's important birthday as well. Our continuing mission statement here at the IPI has been to support the work of the United Nations system, and to do that as creatively and as flexibly as we can. And I think our predecessors in this institution have done it well. Our President, Terry Rod Larson, continues to do it well, as does our Vice President, Adam Lupel. World Water Day today. A day of growing importance in the discourse of the international community, occasioned by so many things. At last, the international community becomes more and more seized of the impact of climate change. You sense it, you feel it. It's not just students going on strike around the world, but frankly, the beginnings of a new consciousness in the international community, given what's happening with world weather events, intense drought and intense storms, on the impact of our planet and the next generation of people who will inhabit the planet. Well, Water Day, of course, causes us to focus as well on Sustainable Development Goal number 6. It's stark in its obligations on us all with Agenda 2030. And I've got to say, Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is probably the most elusive of them all. It's hard. It's about water, clean drinking water for all. It's about sanitation, proper sanitation services for all. And it's also about, of course, making sure we have appropriate provisions for hygiene for all as well, including, and I say this to all the men in the room, get used to saying it, menstrual hygiene for girls. And if we don't make that a centrepiece of what we do in sanitation and water services around the world, we are failing the young women and girls of the world in pursuit of their educational opportunities. So guys, get used to talking about it every day. It should be part of our normal vocabulary and not subject to any particular cultural cringe or embarrassment. As Adam just mentioned, water is not just of passing interest to me. Tony Lake, the former executive director of UNICEF, rang me some years ago and said, I've got a job for you. And I said, I always hate conversations which begin that way. And I said, tell me about it, Tony. He said, how do you feel about sanitation? I said, well, I grew up on a farm in rural Australia and we didn't have any back then, so I feel pretty keenly about it. And he said, I want you to become global chair of Sanitation and Water for All, SWA. And SWA is this global peak body which brings together government and non-government institutions. It brings together the scientific community. It also brings together private and public finance about how we can make a material difference in where we are at present on the provision of water and sanitation and hygiene services for all to where we're expected to be by the time 2030 rolls around. I did ask Tony Lake at the time, so Tony, how many other people have you asked for this job, to do this job, and how many have turned you down? Great thing about Tony Lake is that he's a diplomat and he just changed the topic. So I'm sure I was the 4th person he asked. I'm happy to report this is probably the least sexy of the 16 or 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but that's why he probably chose me. That brings us to today's subject. Because wherever we are on the question of water and hygiene and sanitation, whether we're approaching it from a human development prism, whether we are approaching it from a humanitarian intervention prism, or whether we are approaching it from the prism of what happens in armed conflict. Water and the proper provision of water for civilian populations around the world is critical to every dimension of what the UN multilateral system seeks to do in partnership with member states. Today's event hones in specifically on the role of water in armed conflict, which increasingly is seen as a strategic target by belligerent actors and a weapon to be wielded instead of the basic right that it is for everybody. As UNICEF so powerfully states in its release today, in its new report, children are among the most harshly affected in conflict zones where access to safe water is compromised. If you haven't seen the UNICEF report, It's out today. It's called Water Under Fire. I've just commended the UNICEF team on their creativity and poetry, because that is a very appropriate headline, topic, title for this report. And I thank the UNICEF team for bringing it to us, and we look forward to their contribution today. As UNICEF notes in the report, in many conflicts, more children die from the maladies of unsafe drinking water than direct violence. When reading the report, I'm struck that in protracted conflicts, children under 15 are 3 times more likely to die from diarrhea-related disease from polluted water and poor sanitation than from direct violence. Children under 5 are 20 times more likely to die from the same. Poor access to wash services in conflict zones is often the result of deliberate destruction and sabotage. To use a cruel metaphor, the ripple effect of this is enormous. As the Water Under Fire report notes, not only does this impact a child's health, but also their safety and their education. There are examples across the world of the dark dynamic of water in conflict, from Ukraine, Bangladesh, and Yemen, as UNICEF's report elucidates. The role of water in conflict zones is becoming more prevalent and more lethal, as it increasingly is used as a strategic target and weapon for vulnerable populations. One of the 3 calls that UNICEF makes in this report is to stop attacks on water and sanitation infrastructure and personnel. The Geneva Water Hub's work on the Geneva List of Principles on the Protection of Water Infrastructure seeks to answer this call. This one. I congratulate the Geneva Water Hub and the work that they've done on this. Well done, folks. As drafted, its 22 principles seek to safeguard water infrastructure pre, during, and post-conflict. In doing so, it fills a void at the core of providing water for all, even our most vulnerable, under the most trying of circumstances. The principles contained in this important report from the Geneva Water Hub builds on the body of existing international humanitarian law, human rights law, international environment law, and international water law to provide a concise guide for the complexity of this particular policy space. It moves beyond these areas of law as distinct pools, connecting them to flow as much deeper, richer body that can have a genuine impact. This document was no easy feat, coming together under the leadership of the Geneva Water Hub by a series of panels and workshops from 2016 to 2018. My experience, Danilo, is that nothing moves quickly in the international community. But if you spend a bit of time on it and you consult most of the folks who are engaged, it actually is an important part of the process of building an important global consensus. And Danilo has done excellent work on that score. And in response to specific recommendations made in their Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace report, A Matter of Survival in 2017, led by one of our panelists today, former President of Slovenia, Danilo Turk. This brings together that work as well. So as chair of the IPI, I look forward to today's discussion. As chair or global chair of Sanitation and Water for All, I look forward to the discussion at all as well. And I hope it will assist in strengthening the urgency which we all experience in seeking to address water, sanitation and hygiene for all, for the most vulnerable, even in the most trying circumstances of conflict. To conclude, I thank UNICEF, the Geneva Water Hub, today's event co-sponsor, the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands to the United Nations, all of today's panelists and many others for their leadership in this area of water and armed conflict. And I urge for this momentum to continue from today's event to further strengthen these Geneva List of Principles and through UNICEF and others to continue building political support. And as Danilo Turk and I were discussing just before this session began this afternoon, let us look also here at the IPI about how we play our own small part with convenings here over the next 12 months to continue to build consensus on what now should be done. The excellent work done by these formative reports and the policy recommendations which have come forth from them is one thing. Energising states and energising international institutions now to give them effect is where the challenge now lies. So we hope to play our small part at the IPI in doing just that. Thank you, Adam.
Great. Kevin, thank you so much for those comments, for your support and leadership for IPI. And I think also I should recognize, thank you for the comments on menstrual hygiene for all. It's important to recognize that as we are at the closing day of the Commission on the Status of Women. We've been having a lot of convening over the last 2 weeks on gender-related issues. And I think that note really goes to the point that water is one of these connecting issues that connects all the aspects of UN work, which I think will be evident in our conversation today. We have a great panel. I'm just going to briefly introduce everyone now, and then we'll go right into it. So we have to my right, Mr. Danilo Turk, the third president of the Republic of Slovenia, chairman of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace. And of course, here we also remember him fondly as the former UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs under Kofi Annan. Next to him is Miss Laurence Boisson de Chezorn, full professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Geneva and a member of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace. We have Sandra Pellegrom, Head of Development, Humanitarian and Human Rights Section of the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And finally, we have Mr. Hamish, Chief of Humanitarian Action and Transition Section, Program Division at UNICEF. You have more complete bios in your handouts, but I'm going to leave the introductions there so that we can get right to it. Danilo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And I would also like to start by thanking Kevin for this great introduction. He has laid the foundations for our discussion very well. And I would like to express my pleasure to be here at IPI again. After about 1 year, we came in January last year to present the report, A Matter of Survival, the report of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace. And we then discussed the broad picture of water issues, the growing problems, and the need for sustained and diverse activity. Now, today, we are coming again to IPI to talk about something which is both fundamental and has a long history, namely water and water cooperation. And any professor of international law knows about the great history of international water cooperation, the fact that it is part of many peace treaties and many other treaties, and that today we have to figure out exactly what are the priority tasks for the future. Now, in the report, A Matter of Survival, we identified those tasks both for the situations of an active armed conflict and those which have to be taken at the time of peace, in order to use water as an instrument of peace, use water cooperation as an instrument for prevention of armed conflicts and for strengthening stability and cooperation among people. Now, this is all done in the report of 2017. As we were thinking about follow-up, we thought that it is important to go into some of the more specific activities and to make more specific proposals and engage in specific policy-making discussions. Part of that obviously relates to the situations of armed conflict, and we did not want to shy away from those difficult, terrible problems. Just think about Yemen today. It's a question of life and death of an entire nation, a huge humanitarian catastrophe which is very directly related to the scarce and quickly disappearing resources of water. But speaking more generally, the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2015 made an assessment that there were 50 million people affected by armed conflicts in urban areas, and that they all suffered from problems resulting from reduced or destroyed water supplies. Now we shall hear from UNICEF today what their work shows. Dramatic. Then, obviously, this raises the question of what should be the policy responses. And we should not allow to say that, well, the Security Council, which is the single body of the international community with the most formidable legal and other powers, should be exempt from this discussion. Quite to the contrary, the Security Council of the United Nations has to be at the center of discussion of what kind of policy approaches are needed to protect people in times of armed conflict so that they are not deprived of water as an essential condition for life. Sandra Pellegrom from the Dutch mission knows how the current discussion in the Security Council is going. Netherlands led some of those discussions in the past 2 years, and there is a slow improvement or slow progress as far as I can see it. I see progress in two directions. First, in the situations of the Middle East, the Security Council has in a number of resolutions not only expressed concern over the problems of water, but called for respect and protection of essential civilian infrastructure, including water infrastructure. And that, I think, was an important beginning. We have to think about where to go from there. The second area in which the Security Council has started to express itself in a policy manner is a need to identify sufficiently early the problems of water scarcity, the resulting food insecurity, and the causes of instability which come as a result of all this. So these are the two directions in which the Security Council is already going, but of course there are only a very initial ones, and we have to think about what else needs to be done. When it comes to this question, the panel on water and peace has made several proposals. Some of them were related to the specific actions such as water supply ceasefires, either in the form of deconflicting agreements among parties in conflict, and other ways of protection of water infrastructure. The other policy direction which we also had in mind, and which we would like to present in some more detail today, relates to the Geneva list of principles of protection of water infrastructures during unarmed conflicts. And this is an area where I think we need really thorough discussion. The protection of water infrastructure has been part of the international humanitarian law for decades, but it has been neglected. And we need to figure out what are the steps forward to make sure that these rules become not only well understood, but also effective in practice. And Geneva principles hopefully will help in that effort. Now, this is what I wanted to say at this stage, to simply provide a link between the opening by Kevin Rudd and the next speakers in the panel. Thank you.
Great, Danilo. Thank you so much for indeed making that connection, but also giving us up to date on the follow-up to the high-level panel on water and peace. And a lot of us are really engaged by that report when we launched it here last year. So it's good to know the work continues. We will now hear from Laurence on the principles themselves. Laurence, please.
Thanks. It's also a pleasure to be here today and to present one of the outcomes of the work of the high-level panel on peace and security, water, peace, and security. So, as Danilo Turk has said, that was one of the recommendations. And when we were working between 2015 and 2017, a lot of events took place. First, there were more and more damages to water infrastructure during conflicts that we noticed. Then there were also the issue of the control of dams by certain belligerent actors, and think about the Mosul Dam that was controlled for some time. And then I think, and it goes in line with what Danilo Turk has just said, the Security Council started to pay attention to water, and there were two important discussions at the Security Council dedicated to water. So in this context, we thought that it would be important to further our attention on how to protect water infrastructure during armed conflict. Now, how did we work? So it was a process which was led by the Geneva Water Hub. We have the director in this room, François Munger. And we benefited from the expertise of Dr. Maratinino, who is sitting in front of me, who is teaching at the University of Geneva, and Mrs. Okyu Ekmasen, I don't know where she is, but she's somewhere in this room. They worked very hard in identifying the principles. We had meetings with experts, and we had an important meeting in Geneva last December with representatives of UNICEF, representatives of other international organizations, NGOs. The ICRC was also there. So we could brainstorm and we could think about what should be these principles. And then following this meeting, we worked on the identification of the principles that should be retained. So you have them in this document. And we're not going to be referring in detail to each principles, but we can discuss it further with Mara and Ikkyu during the Q&A session. Now, so main features about this list and what does it mean? So this was said by Mr. Rudd. It gathers principles that should find application in times of armed conflict, before and after, and I'll come back to that. It is the first time ever that all the applicable principles are gathered in a single document. And I think it's very important. And we've gathered in the single document principles coming from different areas of international law. And it's sometimes quite difficult to put all these principles together. So we have principles drawn from the Geneva Conventions on Humanitarian law, from the additional protocols, because they're also very important with respect to water protection. Think about the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, think about proportionality, the protection of civilians, and so on. We have principles drawn from the body of human rights law. We consider that the human right to water and to sanitation is now an existing principle of international law, and we have given it its place in the principles. There are also principles drawn from the body of international environmental law, and for example, the obligation not to cause significant damage to the environment during armed conflicts. And then also principles drawn from what I call the body of international water law, and mostly it's the principles which find application with respect to the management of international water courses. And there, I'll come back to that, but it's important because the body of law dealing with water is also about equity, access to water for all, and it's also about dialogue and cooperation. So that highlight the uniqueness of this list. Now, the second point that I'd like to highlight is that in this list, you have a gathering of the existing principle of law, what we call lex lata, but also we have included recommendations, the lege ferenda, the principles that we think should be pushed forward and should be taken into account in existing practice. Third point that I'd like to stress with respect to this list is that we've taken into account the various dimensions of conflicts. So we have interstate conflicts, international conflicts, but in fact, most of the conflicts are non-international conflicts. And we have a lot of hybrid conflicts, as I call them. So this list is addressed both to states and to non-state actors. And I think this is something which is important for humanitarian law. Non-state actors are bound by obligations too, and in the context of water, that would be the case. Now, the last point that I would like in terms of feature that I'd like to stress, and I'll come back to what has been said by the predecessors, is the fact that there is a temporal dimension to these principles. The first one is we have stressed that there is a conflict, but before conflict arises, there are a lot of things that should be done. So one of the element in this list is that the states should integrate in their domestic systems all the principles that should find application in times of armed conflict. And then there is also something that we noticed that is also already enshrined in the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, is the marking of water infrastructures. Already we have this idea that states should mark these infrastructures so to protect them. And we think that this should be done as a prevention tool so that we can protect them in a more efficient manner. In this context, we're thinking of prevention, and it's in line with what the current Secretary General has asked the United Nations to do. That think in anticipation and do the best you can to protect all these, the means and the essential for people, and so they're better protected in times of armed conflict. Now, the second phase, it's during conflict, and there, obviously, there are a lot of principles of humanitarian law which should find application. But there we also are pushing a bit the limits and think that, in fact, water infrastructures should be protected, should not be the object of military attacks. And this is a principle which is what we would call in legal terms the lege ferenda. But I think we should, having read the report of UNICEF, we realize that it's very important that we push this issue. The other element that we would also like to stress is that the people in charge of repairing the infrastructure, the water infrastructure, should be considered as civilians. And being civilians, they should be protected in times of armed conflict. So those are one or two examples of what we have enshrined in the list. Now, the third phase, it's the post-conflict situation. And Danilo Turk has referred to the ceasefire agreements during a conflict, but also after a conflict. And there we recommended, and it's important that we think about what should be the content of a ceasefire agreement with respect to water sharing. And in international water law, we have a principle which is the principle of equitable and reasonable sharing of the water. So equity should be part of the dimension of a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement. Then there is also the issue of when we think about post-conflict, we think about restoration of dialogue and cooperation. And there, when you look at international water law, you see that there is a lot of attention which is paid to the river basins, joint mechanisms. And history, and this is noticed in our report, has shown that these water commissions are entry points for negotiations, and that states don't interrupt the negotiation about water during an armed conflict. So we think that we should sort of strengthen the importance of the river commissions or the basins commissions so that they can help further the dialogue and restore peace, because that's one also of the key elements of the high-level panel, is that water is a vehicle for cooperation, and we should stress this. Now, the final word is about peacekeeping operations. And in fact, we did a survey about the mandate of peacekeeping operations. There's not much about water. And we think it would be important that more attention is given when designing the mandate of the peacekeeping operations. More attention should be given to the protection of water infrastructure and their reconstruction, rehabilitation, and repair. And that would be important because it would also show the importance for all the people that are depending on this infrastructure. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, I can see already this is and going to be a really useful document. Danilo, in your remarks, you mentioned that the protection of water infrastructure has been a part of international law for a long time, but it's been neglected. And so to take this exercise of actually identifying, gathering all the applicable principles in one document drawn from a variety of sources of international law. You mentioned IHL, human rights law, environmental law, water law, international border law. I mean, I can only, the effort to bring those all together is really, really admirable. And I think as a reference document, this will be extremely helpful. I'm really happy that you made that last comment about peacekeeping, because I was reading, of course, peacekeeping is one of the bread and butter of IPI. We've been working on peacekeeping since our founding. And when I read that principle, I went and spoke to the director of our peacekeeping, our Peace Operations Center, and said, do you know anything about this? And his comment was, I don't think there's much. And so I thought we were missing something. So I'm glad to know that we weren't, that indeed. And I think my sense is you're absolutely right that there needs to be more attention there. So I much appreciate those remarks. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to IPI for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful way to mark World Water Day. So happy World Water Day to all, and thank you for being here. I just wanted to make 4 points that hopefully we can also use for the discussion later. First of all, the need to strengthen international humanitarian law, respect for it, and the protection of civilians, which is really the focus of the topic today. I think, as Danilo Turk said, we see some movement in the Security Council, and of course that is the place where a lot of this work needs to be done. Our experience last year was, yes, it is difficult to work on these issues, but it is also possible. And a good example, I think, is our experience with the adoption in May of Resolution 2417 on conflict and hunger. And that relates very closely, of course, to the issue of water. I think what the resolution manages to do is to really recognize and strengthen the recognition of the link between conflict and hunger. It also really urges parties in a conflict to respect and protect civilian infrastructure around food and nutrition security, and there's a lot of attention also for the water-related infrastructure that goes with that. It calls also for accountability, so that resolution really helps to sort of give us a tool in our hands to look at accountability where parties are not respecting the agreements. And it calls on the Secretary General and the UN system to take into account issues of food and nutrition security and also water infrastructure when they are reporting on country situations. But it also calls on the Secretary General to look at early warning and to seize the Security Council in occasions where the Secretary General and the UN system are seeing signs of increasing food and nutrition security or insecurity. And I think, as I said, the good thing is that in several places in this resolution there is a clear link to water infrastructure, drinking water infrastructure, and irrigation systems. So I think that offers a good link. And it's a good example of how the Security Council can take action. And we are trying to see if we can use this resolution also to continue follow-up and to continue asking for attention. And working very closely, of course, with the present elected 10 members of the Security Council. I'm looking at my German colleague over there. Accountability, of course, is key, and I think the calling out situations like the Security Council did on Yemen last year when there were attacks on water infrastructure, the attack on that bus with school children. We raised that under any other business. We made sure there were press elements. So we have to keep on pushing that agenda. But I think for the discussion, it's interesting also to look at, how further can we use these hooks that we have for accountability to actually really strengthen it. And I think we really support the initiative of Switzerland to see if, starvation can also be, as a weapon of war, can also be recognized in the Rome Statute on for civil conflicts, for non-international conflicts. And again, I think starvation and water are so closely linked as well that is a very good hook. And we also very much appreciate the initiative of the Geneva Principles. We really think it's going to help a lot in trying to see what exactly can we do to strengthen accountability. Second point, and I'll hurry up. Resilience during conflict. I think, and I'm again looking at our experience on food and nutrition security as an example, we've also had quite a few discussions on how can you strengthen resilience during conflict. And of course, this again goes hand in hand with water availability and access to water. And I think it would be interesting for us to think a little bit, in particular with practitioners from the UN in the field, how in such a difficult issue as water availability, could you still try and see if you can strengthen resilience of community to make sure that even during conflict there will be alternatives that could be used. Thirdly, and Danilo Turk I think already mentioned very clearly that it's important not only to look at water availability in conflict, but really also to look at prevention and the role of water as a potential driver of conflict, or at least as a contributor. During our turn in the Security Council last year, we had an extensive briefing on the situation in the Lake Chad region. And we really see there a very strong linkage between conflict and water stress. Water stress, of course, leading to tensions and strengthening social and political tensions that are already there. But then when conflict starts, it again limits further the access that people have to water. So you are in a kind of vicious circle that I really think needs a lot of attention also from the Security Council. And as Mr. Turk said, there has been a lot of attention. We saw Senegal in 2016 putting this on the agenda with an open debate. Bolivia followed up in 2017 with a meeting on transboundary cooperation. And our colleagues from the Netherlands mission with a number of other missions organized an ARIA Formula meeting in October last year on water, peace and security. And for us, I mean, the takeaway was that there's a lot of recognition among many, many member states that this is an issue that deserves more attention. So I think we should continue to build on that. and to encourage the Secretary General and the UN system to include issues of water stress in their analysis, in their risk analysis, in their early warning systems, in putting this on the agenda of the Council at an early enough stage so that early action could be taken. And then, of course, the next question is, also for discussion, what early action then can we take? And we get to water diplomacy and different other actions. And I think also for everybody in the room, you have very good partners, I think, in a number of the elected members to the Security Council also this year. So hopefully more steps can be taken this year. Finally, just to mark, we are on World Water Day. I think for us it's really important that for water we take a holistic approach. Very important to look at water and its role as a driver, hopefully, for peace, water as a human right, and water as essential for development. And we feel that the SDG agenda is an excellent way of looking at these interlinkages and looking across these pillars to approach water holistically. So really an encouragement to continue looking at water holistically, both within SDG 6, where there's many elements that are completely dependent on each other. I mean, we talk a lot about WASH, of course, but without integrated water resource management and sustainability and availability of water, we are not going to be able to ensure that no one is left behind on water and sanitation. The links with other SDGs, of course, are also very important to continue to seek out proactively and to really go out to these other meetings and put issues of water into other discussions. On SDG 12, sustainable production and consumption. On SDG 13, that is so in the center of the attention this year. I mean, let's all go out there. Let's put water on the agenda also over there. And let's make sure that we really continue to look at this whole agenda holistically. Thank you.
Great, Sandra. Thank you so much for sharing your experience from the Council, and note that it is indeed difficult to work on these issues, but that the Security Council resolution on water and hunger is an example of how you can actually work effectively on this, and also on the need to strengthen resilience during conflict, and of course important points on prevention and the holistic approach. I think that really is something that comes out to me, as I said in the beginning, is that water is one of these issues that really connects up peace and security, development, human rights, the whole UN system, and at a time in the context of UN reform, the SDGs, where we're all trying to work across the pillars of the system, water kind of provides an opportunity to really show how that can be done. So I really appreciate that comment. Hamish, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you, everyone. In 2016, it was estimated that there were about 535 million children living in conflict situations around the world. Every one of them needs clean water. I'm not sure how many kids were living in conflict areas 20 years ago. Maybe not as many, but some hundreds of millions I would still guess. I knew some of those kids all that time ago because I lived with some of them in a village on the edge of the Sobat River in an area called Eastern Upper Nile Province in the southern part of Sudan, which was one country at the time. I worked for an NGO that supported a small public health and education program in the village and did outreach in the surrounding areas. Among the various little things we did, we had a water and sanitation project. We were installing tanks to catch rainwater, and during the dry season, we had a pump and a filter system to get water out of the river. And it was small scale, but it made a difference in that little village. One night, a nearby militia group raided. This was not uncommon, and they came to steal the cattle. We were safe, we weren't worried, they were just after the cattle. But the next morning, we realised they'd trashed the pumps, the bladder, the tap stands, and they'd stolen the filters. I can't repeat here the language I used that morning. It was very Australian, let's say. Kevin would probably understand how angry I was. I wasn't worried about us. We had bottled water and we had a few small filters and things like that. To start with, I wasn't so worried about the school and the clinic and the village. Because we had a flight due in the next day. We only had air access at the time. And I called our base in northern Kenya and told them what had happened and could they send some new pumps and filters. We could sort it.
only the flight didn't come. It was diverted somewhere else to medevac some injured people. Fair enough. Well, another day, we'll be okay. But the days kept passing and that damn Buffalo aeroplane never came. And people had to drink, so they took their water straight out of the river. It was the dry season, so the river was low, it was muddy, and it was affected by all sorts of things. It's hard to describe how fast the kids, well, the whole village went downhill. People started getting sick before our eyes. Kids stopped coming to school. Some turned up at the clinic with diarrhea and other illnesses, but most just seemed to retreat into their huts. Soon the clinic was swamped and the school was closed, and there was hardly anyone in the little marketplace that we had. What really struck me more than anything else was the silence that descended over our little village. I know it sounds sort of melodramatic, but it was stark and it was real, and we could feel it. Then all at once, a couple of flights came together, finally. Seemed an eternity, but it wasn't that long. We fixed the pumps, we fixed the filters and the taps and everything else, and things were almost back to the way they were before. The reason I say almost is because we did see a sustained increase in malnutrition rates among the kids. That took a while to clear. And two of the kids at the school, two I remember well because I used to play soccer with them on the airstrip after class. They just never came back. I never saw them again. I don't know what happened to them. That's one personal story from some time ago, but it's sadly typical of what is still happening and on an increasing scale all over the world. We've already heard from Kevin some of the numbers on the key impacts of water on children in conflict situations, so I won't repeat them. But there's one in particular that I think is worth emphasising, and that's the fact that children under 5 are 20 times more likely to die from disease linked to unsafe water and sanitation than direct conflict. 20 times. Without water, children simply cannot survive. In times of crisis, injured and sick children need to be treated in hospitals with safe children. Going beyond conflicts worldwide, over 2 billion people don't have access to safe water, and 4.5 billion do not use safe sanitation. Again, Kevin mentioned the previous UNICEF Executive Director, Tony Lake, and his commitment. I'm pleased to say that our new Executive Director, Henrietta Fore, is equally committed and is carrying on the same work. She recently stated very clearly that deliberate attacks on water and sanitation are attacks on vulnerable children, and that water is a basic right. It is a necessity for life. In conflicts, deliberate and indiscriminate attacks destroy water and sanitation. They injure people and cut off the power that keeps water running. Lack of water also has an impact on children's ability to attend school. When there's no sanitation in schools, girls are likely to drop out during menstruation, and they miss out on their right to education. Lack of access to water also exposes children, and again, especially girls, to sexual violence when they're forced to walk long distances to collect water or just go to the toilet. Attacks on water and sanitation infrastructure have to stop. Blocking efforts to restore services and provide emergency relief, including by creating political and logistical barriers, is also a violation. These actions are also attacks on water and sanitation and personnel, and they are therefore also attacks on children and must stop. I'm sure everyone here today, we've heard all about the Geneva list of principles, which are very important. Application of these principles is key to protecting water and ensuring children have unimpeded access to water and sanitation in their communities, their schools, their health facilities. To support the realisation of these principles, UNICEF's advocating for 3 things in particular. We would like to see the international community and intergovernmental systems take a stronger and a more robust approach to attacks on water. And again, I won't repeat because a lot of people have already talked about the role of the Security Council. Again, just to say that that's the top of our list too, that we think the Security Council has a critical role to play. I'll just add in particular a monitoring and reporting mechanism that the Security Council could use could be a very useful tool to highlight attacks on water and obviously to prevent them. I'd also just like to say we'd like to advocate too for the General Assembly and ECOSOC, where all member states are represented, to address the issue directly and strongly. Number two, there's an urgent need to increase capacity in the humanitarian water and sanitation sector. As conflicts have become more complex and with less and less respect for humanitarian law, humanitarian principles, it's become increasingly more difficult to provide water and sanitation services through our humanitarian programming, and it's become increasingly difficult to reach all people and children in particular in need. More capacity is needed and to meet these needs. And third and finally, as conflicts drag out over many years, we need to take a longer approach to humanitarian work by bringing in some of the thinking from the development sector. This is the so-called humanitarian development peace nexus, or as Sandra pointed out, it's building resilience in a humanitarian context. While always respecting humanitarian principles, in particular neutrality and partiality, there are ways that we can meet humanitarian needs that will increase local capacity and leave something, including infrastructure, behind after the conflict. Linking humanitarian and development work can also be much more cost effective, and it can give peace agreements a much greater chance of succeeding. And there are some concrete examples of this being done now, in particular in Yemen, that are highlighted in this publication. Our organisation, UNICEF, the wider UN system, many NGOs and of course many member states are all making efforts in this direction. However, a lot more needs to be done. In particular, consistent longer term and more flexible financing arrangements for humanitarian programs could make a real difference here. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the IPI, the Geneva Water Hub and the Government of the Netherlands for convening this event and bringing us here today. But mostly I'd like to thank everybody that's here in the audience for coming along and listening to us speak, and for all your support and efforts to address this very important issue. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. In particular, thank you for that personal story from Sudan that you started with. I think that it really makes tangible how essential the connection between health and safe water is. We often think about access to water, but it has to be access to safe water, of course, and how precarious that relationship can be, how quickly it can descend. I also appreciate the comment about the need to take a longer look. Some of our work on humanitarian affairs here at IPI is beginning to look at this humanitarian development nexus. You mentioned the case of Yemen. I noted you have in the report the case study on Cox's Bazar, and I think I told you before we came in that just a couple weeks ago we had the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh here speaking about the situation in Cox's Bazar and the health crisis within the humanitarian crisis, and I think water issues were front and center there, so I really appreciate those comments. We've got plenty of time for a Q&A, so the floor is open, but we're going to first come here to the representative from the ICRC who would like to make a comment.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Frassetto. I'm an advisor here at ICRC delegation to United Nations. Just wanted to offer a few additional comments from the ICRC perspective to complement what has already been excellent presentations by the panelists. So everyone today has said and demonstrated that essential services are not immune to the impact of armed conflict. And so what do we mean by essential services first? We mean, at least when we speak a bit about water, wastewater, and energy primarily. ICRC's long experience in armed conflict has basically shown, and allowed us to develop a body of evidence to see the humanitarian consequences of urban warfare. So what have we seen? The most devastating effects happen when the front line of a conflict goes static in an urban area for any extended period of time, or when conflicts with heavy military operations, both air and ground, become protracted. And I think given these two realities, understanding the basics of what we mean by operational continuity of essential services is imperative if civilians in armed conflict are to have access to these services. So what are essential services? So essential services are comprised of people. And this can be service providers, it can be operators, technicians, repair crews. Essential services are hardware, infrastructure, equipment, and consumables, fuel, chemicals for water treatment, and filters. Essential services are interdependent, and as such, services can be disrupted by interconnected direct, indirect, or cumulative impacts. So the trends on the ground reveal that there are numerous reasons for the disruption of the provision of water during times of armed conflict. Often the most visible is the destruction of or damage to water, sanitation, and electricity supply infrastructure. However, there are other reasons why this can occur. It can also be the result of the misuse of infrastructure. It can be the result of the destruction of warehouses storing spare materials. It can be the death, injury, or lack of safe access for people to carry out the operation, maintenance, and repair of these systems. Another point I want to make is that, importantly, it's not only necessary to address humanitarian consequences, but also the root causes. So the scale and complexity and duration of some of conflicts today, as mentioned by the panel today, necessitate an organization like ICRC to strengthen our prevention and protection action on the basis of humanitarian law to mitigate the humanitarian needs. And what this means really practically is that we can't really only focus on addressing humanitarian needs after the fact, sometimes repairing the same infrastructure over and over again, but rather working on both at the same time. Finally, I just want to end by saying, what does international humanitarian law actually say on this topic? So, first and foremost, IHL provides general protection to civilians and civilian objects, which include each of the three components that I mentioned, people, hardware, and consumables. It requires that parties to conflict distinguish between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military objectives. And this is particularly important for this topic when we talk about the interconnected nature of essential services and that depend on critical civilian infrastructure in armed conflict. Second, IHL also provides special protection to certain persons and objects from direct attack, as well as from indiscriminate attack. And what this means in practical terms is attacks of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction. Notably, objects indispensable to the survival of civilian populations, such as drinking water installations, irrigation works, must not be attacked, destroyed, removed, or rendered useless. Thanks very much for your time and for allowing me the floor and for calling attention to this important issue.
Great, thanks. I saw one hand in the back, yeah. And then we'll come over to the...
Thank you very much. Mohammed Ibrahim from United Nations Department of Peace Operations. Actually, I have a question and a comment at the same time. I think the legends say that the Sheba civilization ended or came to an end when the dam they built was destroyed and the flood ended the civilization over there and the people had to move from Yemen. And interesting enough, you speak about the water factor in the struggle in Yemen today as well. I came through, I read quickly the principles, and I think Principle 16 speak about the forced displacement, which is my point actually, that sometime it's not the destruction of the dams, but maybe building dams in order to flood a certain region to displace people might be the reason. So it's not the deprivation of water, but like really abuse of water might be a reason for the displacement of the people from their motherland. So maybe it's there, but I couldn't see it. So it might, I know it's still a draft, so I think the principle also might add some point like that. Also the other point, which is the safety and security of the accessibility of water. Working in peacekeeping, most of the women victims of rape in the refugee camps, they are subject to these crimes while they are trying to secure their daily portion of water. So the safety and security of and accessibility of water is extremely important to enjoy the rights to water, actually. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And over here, Gay, to the left, yeah.
Thank you. Gay Rosenblum Kumar with Nonviolent Peace Force and Peace Direct, two NGOs that address conflict at the very local community level. And we have seen where water disputes, for example, between farmers and herders, can also be opportunities for building conflict resolution skills and the mediative capacities of communities. For example, supporting local level peace and development committees, which can help communities resolve this specific conflict, but also build very longer term lasting skills for conflict resolution on future issues. My question is, can you share how these kind of local level aspects are connected to and given attention in the higher level intergovernmental initiatives that you're part of? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Should we come back to the panel? Yep. We have a direct question about Principle 16, Lois. Maybe you want to address that?
I also wanted to...
Please, any responses that you'd like to make? And then we'll have another round of questions.
So the first thing is that, and I thank the representative of the ICRC for his intervention, I was a bit cursory and a bit brief about the presentation of this sort of the scope of the principles. If you look at Principle 2, the definitions, I spoke only of water infrastructure, but this was generic because, in fact, we also cover water-related infrastructure. And in this context, we mean the facilities, installations, and other works which make an essential contribution to the functioning of water infrastructure. So it's this interconnectedness that you've stressed, which is very important, and we're very much aware of that. And the ICRC is working a lot about the situation of war and conflicts in big cities and the urban environment. And in this context, there are a lot of issues that should be stressed with respect to vulnerability. The other question is that, and it's in relation to, but I don't think it's in Principle 16 is speaking about forced displacement, and that is in the context of an armed conflict that we're speaking about. But if I well understood you, you were speaking about also the before conflicts and the fact that we also have to think about where we're going to be locating these installations and for which reasons and so on. And in fact, it's linked to the roots of conflicts very often when people have been displaced and they've not been really adequately compensated or were badly displaced and so on. So this rule, this Principle 16 would be, it reads the control over the delivery of water and deprivation thereof must not be used to force displacement of civilians. This is strictly in times of armed conflict. And we didn't speak about the situation before.
Yes, I'd like to comment on the second question to Mr. Rosenblum. See, an example actually could be derived from our discussions which our team has had yesterday and today, and where we focused on something that has been very much at the center of UN attention these days, and that is the situation in the Sahel, which we are familiar with. You are familiar with the strategy that UN has developed and has actually refined in 2018. Of course, the situation has been there for a long time and has different dimensions. But of course, there is a comprehensive UN strategy formulated, but not really implemented to the levels that would be adequate. And one of the key problems in the implementation is precisely what you were talking about, and that is how to bring the general policy orientation, which is positive, which is necessary, in line with what is doable at the very local level, where you need to work out appropriate peaceful arrangements of coexistence, cooperation, sharing of resources, and so forth. So this is really the critical problem there, because by addressing violence from the top, simply by military means, by providing more arms to the armies of the countries concerned, you're not going to solve the problem. That's not a solution. This may be necessary in order to protect territories, to protect certain vital infrastructures and so forth. But this is not a solution to the problem. A solution has to come with a good combination from both sides. Now, the paradox here is that the shortage of resources is not the primary obstacle to figuring out how that should be done. There are other obstacles. Now, the Geneva Water Hub has organized a roundtable in Geneva last year in November, which succeeded to bring together very interesting mix of people that included also military people, all very well aware of all the hard security aspects, and people with a very good basis in the local communities who know what would work in order to create patterns of cooperation that are necessary for sustainable peace. Now, this was an initial effort, and we have discussed this with various people in the UN Secretariat in the past, yesterday and today, and we are really looking forward to figuring out how these things could get together. Because of the assessment we share, there's no doubt about the analysis and the assessment of the situation. The question is, who is capable of bringing together the existing capacities, some of which are very local and should be respected as vital for the solution of the problem. So I'm sure that my colleagues from the Geneva Water Hub will be able to contact, to develop further contacts with you, and we'll see what can be done. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to very quickly, complement what Dr. Turk said on the second question from our colleagues from Peace Direct, because this is very much the area that UNICEF works in. We've got a small, modest peace-building program, and it's focused very much at sort of intercommunal level peace building. But what is critical there is, and I think it's now fairly well recognised, I forget the exact number, it was around 80% of peace agreements reached in the post-Cold War era fail, at least to some extent, the first time round, and they have to be rebuilt and recreated over and over in many cases. A lot of analysis has been done as to why they failed. One of the key, not the only one, but one of the key findings of a lot of research is that historically peace agreements have focused at a high political level. It's restoring governance, rule of law, the judiciary. A lot of effort goes into stabilising the security sector, all of which is important, but it turns out not sufficient. And that what happens is, while that's going on, there's an expectation that social services will come later as a peace dividend. But in fact, out in the sort of communities that you're referring to, if they don't start getting their social services right away, they lose confidence in what's going on at the capital or the high level. So increasingly, we're seeing the delivery of social services being front-loaded into the overall approach to stabilisation and building, re-establishing peace. But it's got to be done in a conflict-sensitive way. You gave the classic example between pastoralists and farmers and disputes over water. We look at that a lot when we're doing water and sanitation projects in a post-conflict environment. I know it's slightly off water, but I think it's still relevant. Education and re-establishment of education services, same thing. You rebuild or build a school, you put it in the wrong place, you can trigger a dispute. You use the wrong curricula, you'll trigger a dispute. Even the wrong language of instruction. So all of these sorts of things are critical to supporting the high-level peace agreements. And I think that's now increasingly being recognised and they're being front-loaded. Thanks. Sandra, did you?
Thank you. And also building on that question, I think you are also asking, okay, what this high-level work that we're doing, how does it connect really to the country level? I think that is, very, very important. And I really see this effort that we have been trying to do, where we get the Secretary General and the UN system to really take these issues into their analysis. The point of that is really that, they look at potential water stress and the links to social and political stress that might already be there, how it links together, how communities are affected, and then take that into the reports to the Security Council so that it can be a basis for early action. And early action then needs to go back to that specific situation and build on that knowledge that's already there about these, these relationships in the community. I mean, of course, that's the ideal picture, and I don't think we're there yet, but I think that is the reason why we feel it's so important that, the Security Council gets good reports, good risk analysis that really, doesn't just blatantly say, oh, there's a water stress, but that links the water stress to the social and the political factors and how they interact. And one of the instruments that we've launched together with the World Resources Institute last year is the Water, Peace and Security Initiative that tries to build a tool that actually does that, to sort of link the climate stress, water stress to the social and political issues that are out there. Secondly, and a little bit more towards the point made by the gentleman from DPO, this, I think, comes back to my point about a holistic approach to water, which would be, ideally speaking, prevention rather than trying to solve things when a conflict has started. And I think, one way that we've tried to contribute to that is as a member of the high-level panel on water, which produced its report last year also on World Water Day. So that's a year ago today. And that includes an agenda for action that has as a very important element valuing water. And I think what the 11 world leaders that produced that report are trying to say is that we need to start recognizing different values that different parties attach to water, and make sure that we do that at a moment in time when we can still reconcile them, when there is an opportunity to bring these different values and different stakeholders together to, openly and transparently discuss what value does water have for you in a specific situation. And our dream would be that if we try to sort of bring that concept out into our SDG work, into our conflict prevention work much more, that at some point we'll be able to start preventing these type of conflicts, because we've been able to deal with these different values for different stakeholders at an early enough stage. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? Yes, here, one here and one here.
Thanks very much. My name is Manik Mehta. I'm a journalist. You spoke about armed conflicts erupting as a result of water shortages or what have you. Do you see any potential countries or regions where you could expect an armed conflict erupting in the future?
Little horizon scanning. Yes, over here on the third row.
Hello, Catherine Tinker. I suppose this question is primarily to the international law professors, but you mentioned water course agreements. Could you comment, does this also apply to transboundary aquifers, or are there special considerations in the case of such water bodies?
Very specific, very good question. One more for this round, anyone else? No, okay. The law professor.
Thanks. With respect to international water courses, this is something I think that is important to stress, is that the attention so far by the international community has been put on surface water and certain underground waters which are related to surface water. But in fact, there is more and more attention paid to transboundary aquifers, because most of the water that we're using is coming from aquifers and not surface waters. So with that, we are also including these mechanisms. The problem is that we don't have many mechanisms of that time that have been negotiated by states. And in fact, it's one of the activity of the Geneva Water Hub is to look at some of the aquifers and to see how the key stakeholders could meet and negotiate sort of equitable and sustainable agreements for protecting these waters. As far as I'm an academic, so I can speak in my own terms, I think that transboundary aquifers are often orphans, and they're not really well protected by international law.
Okay.
I'd like to make two brief comments on each of the two questions. Now, first on aquifers. It is true that there are only very few agreements on aquifers, and aquifers are difficult to make subject of international agreements, although the basic principles of international law are there. Fair and equitable sharing, do no significant harm. These are fundamental principles which apply in practically all water-related situations. And as Professor Washon de Chazurno explained in her opening remarks, this should be also the guiding principle or the guiding rule in the water ceasefires and everything that happens during armed conflict itself. And it applies mutatis mutandis to all water situations. That is, fair and equitable sharing, do no significant harm. Now, how does that apply to aquifers, to transboundary shared aquifers, where states would normally proceed in their analysis and in their policy from the fact that they are territorially sovereign? That whatever is under the surface within their borders is theirs. It is. Now, the whole idea of sharing is more difficult to develop in this sort of circumstances. Now, what I think is important nowadays is to accept a discussion. Obviously, the International Law Commission has done some work in that regard, but this is not a question for lawyers. Lawyers can work out fairly good principles, and they can analyze the entire history of law in relation to these questions, and would give you clearly very coherent, very wise, very useful advice. But that would not persuade the policymakers who have to think primarily about their own political situations or about their own day-to-day political worries. So that's where the problem is. And I think UN can be useful for taking this discussion forward. How that could be done? Well, I think one of the areas is SDG 6. The whole discussion on sustainable development goals. What does it mean, sustainability of development relating to water? What kind of nexuses should be considered in that regard? Is it appropriate that countries which are heavily relying on underground water spend more than 70 or 80% of that water for agriculture? Are the new technologies for agricultural use of water possible in places where they were not done before, and so forth? So there are many demanding, complex issues, some of which are very technical also, which have to be put on the agenda. I mean, the water situation requires that to happen. So that's for the situations in time of peace. As far as the situations concerning water in armed conflict, then again, the same wisdom applies. Of course, it has to be applied mutatis mutandis, depending on the specific circumstances. The other question was about where do we expect next war over water? Well, I would say if it was so simple, then we would not need any reports, because water issues come into the equation in a much more complicated way. It's not that countries go to war with another country because of water and no other reason. That's not the pattern which we now see. This is not the pattern that we have to be too afraid of. What we have to be afraid of are different things. Internal problems within borders of a single state. And there, of course, the international community initially has very limited capacity, because much of that will be considered as internal affair. I was in the UN Secretariat at the time when we were trying to figure out the approach to the situation in Darfur, which was largely about water, which was about different ethnic communities and different other groups, and water was the underlying factor of that war. And the UN could not find an appropriate approach to it. We at that time thought, well, if an approach is found vis-à-vis the earlier conflict, that is between North and South, the question of South Sudan, then the very fact that this political solution or political process would be there, that in itself is likely to lead to better ability of international community to figure out what the solutions for Darfur would be. Now, that was the approach taken, and that was the approach that did not work. And of course, now we are in a different situation where we have to understand that water continues to be a major problem of the region. And the lesson that we have to learn from the past is that we need to understand water, as you were saying, understand water, and figuring out how the international community can help in Darfur today to ensure that water-related relations, water-related things are managed properly. Now, as a Slovenian, I must say proudly that one of our activists has collected money for for water drilling equipment and brought it to Sudan. Now the circumstances allow drilling in areas where that was not possible before the war in the past. His name is Tomo Križnar. He's very known in Slovenia and in some other places, and among people who were trying to do something helpful in Sudan. So this is now the time when a new, more responsible, more sophisticated policy can be brought into the picture. Now I know that this doesn't answer the question directly, but the problem of water is not that there would be war exclusively because of a water resource, but water will come into the equation of a conflict primarily within a state, possibly regionally, as a part of a more complex picture, and we have to take care of the entire complexity.
Yeah, sure, Sandra, please.
Just to add to that, I think one of the challenges we're seeing is that, of course, when you have mechanisms that will allow you to see where water stress is contributing to a potential conflict, the idea is that you would be able to take early action, or support countries to deal with this internally. But I think, as you said, that is very difficult if, in the regular situation, when there was not a situation of conflict or potential conflict, but just a regular development situation, if in that regular development situation, as a UN system, for instance, you haven't been able to work on promoting integrated, sustainable water management, how are you going to be able to do it once there is a risk of conflict? So I think we would encourage the UN system to much closer work together to make sure that, in promoting the SDGs and supporting countries to implement the SDGs, there is a need for looking at water in to strengthen the effort that the UN is able to provide on water. We feel that, the UN is very strong on water and sanitation out of the MDG agenda. But we've moved to the SDGs because we recognize that there's an interlinkage and that we need to look at water in a wider context because of all these issues that we are discussing. So I think there is an encouragement to really, as a UN system, come together around this more holistic and integrated water agenda and see where you can support countries and national governments that are asking that support more solidly on that.
Great. Did you want to say something, Hamish?
Just very briefly, I think it's all been covered. Well, perhaps one point to consider, again, looking at the situation from the perspective of a child who might be looking at a lifetime of, 50, 60, hopefully 80, 90 years, we need to think and start urgently, I think, building into our analysis the impacts of climate change on water, access to water, and the interplay between climate change and conflict. And I could probably talk about that for a long time, but I'll stop there. But just to say that I think it is important to keep that in mind.
Great. Florence, you wanted to chime back in? Is there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something with respect to the link between water and conflict. One of the key stakeholders in Geneva is the UNEP post-conflict unit, and it's a very interesting place where they have done a lot of reports about what has happened during a conflict and what were the reasons of the conflicts and so on. And it's quite interesting to see how water is often linked to a conflict among the routes. So I would encourage you to look at these reports. And I was also going to refer you also to the IPCC reports, the International Panel on Climate Change reports, and especially the last ones. In fact, there are a lot of links between the increasing of the temperature and the decrease of the flows of international watercourses and the problems which might arise from that. So we have, I think, indication of some triggering effects due to water scarcity and water stress. Now that I have the floor, I'd like to say something that maybe we can discuss that with the audience. Mrs. Sandra Pellegrom referred to accountability, and I think accountability is very important. Now, we have also decided that we should work on accountability, but we decided that at the first stage we would identify the applicable principles, and then we would be looking at what should be done if these principles are not respected, abided by, and so on. And so thinking about that and we've drawn lessons from the meeting that we had in December. In fact, we already have quite many mechanisms which are collecting the information, collecting and monitoring the possible violations. And we think that there is no room for creating a new institution, but I think we should be relying on these existing mechanisms. And we will work on that. The other issue that I think is important, that was alluded to by Mrs. Pellegrom, is in relation also to international criminal law, war crimes. Okay, why not linking water to war crimes? And so there is the issue of the war crime as defined by Article 8 of the Statute of the International Criminal Court. There is also the case law of the Yugoslavian Tribunal. And there is, and water is not just about war crime. I think it's also about crimes against humanity and genocide. And poisoning water could be something that could be looked at from the perspective of genocide and so on. So this is an area where we're going to be working and looking at the consequences of the breaches of obligations.
Thank you. We could take one or two more questions if there is anyone wants to jump in. Okay. No one else. Great. So then I think that, I mean, for me, one of the key questions that comes out of this accountability question, because when the work of compiling these principles lends me to the question of how can we reinforce normative commitments against attacks on water and at the same time implement them into a broader preventative framework at a time when normative commitments to IHL in general are being undermined. So I look forward to this next step. I don't think we have any more questions. So if you, Danilo, do you have any concluding remarks before we hand the floor over to Mr. Rudd?
Well, look, you just offered us a very important question. How to make sure, how to help this, to stop the erosion of the authority of the humanitarian law. And this is one of the questions which clearly comes out of our discussion and from our reports, and also from many other sources nowadays. I think that there is no single formula for that, but that it has to be done in a way which combines policy and law. Now, I have no capacity to predict how these things will go. But in international law, we are told, or we learn that these principles come as a result of historically established wisdom. Now, humanity can divert from them, it can neglect them, it can also violate them, but then eventually it comes back. The question is at what cost, and how wise we are to prevent that cost to be too high. That's fundamentally the answer. Of course, when that answer is then developed into further question, what are your proposals? Then I would say, well, our proposal is work with the Security Council now. All the major powers that have the capacity to provide a real power to the humanitarian law are there. And they have to be constantly reminded of their responsibility. They were given special status within the United Nations Charter because they have special responsibilities for international peace and security. And that special responsibility includes the responsibility to uphold the humanitarian law. Now, this may sound a bit too optimistic, some would say naive and so forth, but I don't think that we have many other approaches that we can choose from. We have that approach and we have to insist. And sooner or later, these things will turn. I hope that they will turn before the price becomes too high.
Any other concluding comments from the panel? No. Kevin, please.
Well, folks, I think we've had a great discussion here this afternoon here at the IPI, and I'd thank all the participants. It's been a very sharp and useful set of remarks. For those of you who have remained with us for the duration of the afternoon, there'll be a test as you leave. Those of you who pass the test will be able to list all 22 of the Geneva Principles. I've just read them, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. But those of you who fail, you'll be detained afterwards. Seriously, the work of the 22 Principles is really good for those of you who've done the concrete work. Let me give you a practical example, reminded of this by our Dutch colleague who's present with us. In an international security operation in Afghanistan, we, Australia, and when I was Prime Minister, Kingdom of the Netherlands, were jointly responsible for one of the most difficult provinces in the country called Oresgon. You may remember this. Now, having been at that stage looking in detail at our rules of engagement and in detail at the mission statement for our combined forces of several thousand troops in that particular province, I cannot remember one articulation in that of our responsibilities in relation to the protection, maintenance or building of water-related infrastructure. So there's just an example for both of us. As it turned out, operationally, because we're decent people, we did this, but it was by accident rather than, as it were, conscious reflection of the existing principles of international law to be then, as it were, interpolated into operational guidelines for forces, peacekeeping or security forces on the ground. So that's one minor example of the importance of this work. Secondly, I'm so glad that the conversation at the end, Danilo and Francois, turned to the question of enforcement, turned to the question of implementation, turned to the question of what's politely called in the international community of nations accountability, less politely called sanctions, which is what happens to the violators, be they state actors or non-state actors. And I'm in the league of the international optimists and the naive, like Danilo, which is the UN Security Council under the Charter has particular responsibilities. And this should become, as our Dutch friends are obviously seeking to do through the deliberations of the Council, more and more of a normal consideration in terms of the remit of the Council in particular fields of armed conflict around the world. So unless we take that to the next step, then there is a danger that these fine principles end up as a dead letter. The normative impact of, shall I say, responsible states around the world who take their international legal obligations seriously is useful. But beyond that, when we look to more problematic actions by states and non-state actors around the world, this whole question of accountability through the existing mechanisms of the international community under UN law needs to be, I think, the next step. Which brings me to my third point, which is the virtue, as you've said, of these Geneva Principles is the consolidation of what has been work by a large number of multilateral bodies over many decades in the existing fabric of international humanitarian law and elsewhere. That is good in itself. The question I would leave for you, and some of you may have already considered this, is given you've done such a good job at consolidation, does the next challenge lie with a consolidation within a specific resolution which draws the elements together of the Council, the Assembly, the General Assembly, or both? I'll leave that to you to think about. Of course, if I was arguing as counsel for the defence of the proposition, it would be, what do member states have a problem with? All these principles already exist. But it may be a mechanism to simply bring further concerted attention to the paramount importance of these principles by drawing them together through an authoritative resolution of an appropriate UN body. My final point is, I noticed buried in the text of determined steps a reference to no strike lists. This is on page 14 of the document. Not for further discussion here, And of course, the principles of not targeting water-related or civilian-related infrastructure are covered throughout the body of the other principles. I'd be very interested to see what further work could be done on that, because I think that, again, brings us to the sharp edge of implementation and, as it were, political, moral, and ultimately legal responsibility in the international system. So for all of those entities involved, including what UNICEF is doing on the ground, and I thank you, Hamish, for again reminding us of the graphic nature of the story from the ground up in your work in Sudan all those years ago. But for those of you like UNICEF, the Geneva Water Hub, and member states, and the excellent work you've done, Danilo, through the high-level panel, thank you on behalf of the IPI and I think of all reasonable members of the international community. And thank you for being with us here at the IPI. We hope to do similar events on water in the coming year.